In Australia, the federal government is displaying similar disregard for the truth, although not on quite as grand a scale. Inflation, the environment, our long-suffering Indigenous population and housing are all issues that are central to the government's agenda. Its policies, though, only make things worse. The government is trying to solve inflation by spending more on your medical, housing, energy and childcare expenses, which would be fine if the chief driver of inflation wasn't government spending. The more money the government pumps into the economy, the higher prices go. Treasurer Jim Chalmers just hopes you won't notice. Energy Minister Chris Bowen has put a cap on how much resource companies can charge domestically for Australian gas, which might put a lid on prices at home, but in the long term discourages further investment in the sector at a time when Australia desperately needs to increase its gas production to keep the lights on and industry operating. Bowen is instead caring for the environment by aiming for net zero emissions by 2050, but will only do so using toxic windmills, solar panels and batteries, which have a short shelf life and are not recyclable, so will quickly wind up in landfill and in some cases leaching chemicals into the ground. The government ignores the most effective method to achieve net zero, nuclear, which is undeniably the cleanest and safest form of energy generation. Nuclear is also, unlike solar and wind, a long-term investment. And of course, the government is pushing ahead with a plan to give certain Indigenous people a louder voice in Parliament, but which will do nothing to alleviate the horrific violence and destitution being endured by vulnerable women and children in outback Indigenous communities. And finally, the government is hoping to solve the housing crisis by building what it calls affordable and social housing, most of which will be owned by either the government or corporate developers, when the government knows the best solution in reality is to incentivise people to buy their own home and for tradies to build them. The government should have no role in housing other than to clear the land and provide the utilities. The notion of private ownership of property is one of the founding principles of our society, but our increasingly socialist government is abandoning that. The government in the Australian Capital Territory is behaving likewise by rushing through legislation to, wait for it, compulsorily acquire the Calvary Hospital in Canberra. You won't believe this. The speed with which this is being done is as frightening as the fact that it is being done at all. This is a case of a private organisation building a hospital on leased public land, then having that hospital being taken back by the government without being told how much compensation it will receive. Could it be that the ACT government is hoping nobody will care because the owner of the hospital is a corporation owned by the Catholic Church? Never mind how you feel about the church or even how you feel about the medical industry. If the ACT government can get away with this, other governments can get away with compulsorily acquiring your home. There's no difference. The corruption being revealed in the United States and the spin that comes out of our own government here in Australia every day are reminders that these politicians and bureaucrats are increasingly dismissive of the rights and prosperity of ordinary citizens. These are increasingly troubling times.